All right, welcome to the Deep Dive. Today we've got a fascinating figure to unpack. We're diving into the world of Joseph Butler, an 18th century Anglican theologian. Now, what's intriguing is that his sermons are packed with some really sharp moral philosophy, and we're going to tackle one of his core arguments today. It's this whole idea that self-interest and morality, like, are they friends or foes?
Right, they're often pitted against each other, like, can you really be a good person and still look out for number one?
That's exactly the battle Butler was engaged in, right? And he's coming at this from the pulpit, no less.
Yeah, and he develops this, incredibly rigorous argument to show that self-interest and morality aren't enemies at all.
So, in this deep dive, our mission is to extract Butler's key insights, right? How did he understand human nature? What makes us tick?
Yeah.
We're going to explore this crucial role he gave to conscience. And then we've got to delve into his takes on self-love and benevolence.
Absolutely.
How did he see these forces interacting? How did he challenge those maybe more self-centered philosophies of his time?
Yeah, it's a very sophisticated perspective, and honestly, it's still relevant today. Even for folks who are already deep into philosophy, Butler's got some thought-provoking stuff to offer.
Okay, so first things first, let's set the stage. Who was this Joseph Butler? What was going on intellectually in his world?
All right, so Butler was born in 1692, and get this, his early education was at a dissenting academy.
Dissenting?
Yeah, meaning it wasn't affiliated with the Church of England. And that's kind of interesting because it exposed him to some heavy hitters of the day, Locke, Samuel Clarke.
Ah, okay.
And in fact, while he was still a student, he actually got into this philosophical back and forth with Clarke. Like, he was challenging Clarke's theological arguments in letters.
Wow, a student taking on a big-time philosopher. That's bold.
Right. This even led to a published exchange, anonymous at first, of course, but it shows Butler's sharp mind, even from a young age.
Talk about an early start. So how did he go from, sparring with philosophers to becoming this prominent Anglican theologian?
So, soon after these early intellectual duels, Butler decided to join the Church of England. He studied at Oxford, got ordained, and became a preacher at Rolls Chapel in London.
Okay.
Now, what's interesting is that Rolls Chapel was connected to the equity courts.
Equity courts?
Yeah, and some think this legal context might have subtly shaped his ideas about conscience, like what's fair, what's right. He even got a law degree during this time.
Wow.
Then, in 1726, he published his 15 sermons preached at the Rolls Chapel. This collection, especially the second edition a few years later with his really insightful preface, that's the foundation of his moral philosophy. Later, he became the Bishop of Bristol, then the Bishop of Durham.
Bishop of Durham, that's a big deal.
Yeah, big deal. And he also published this influential work on natural theology, the analogy of religion, which included the dissertation on virtue.
Okay, but it's still kind of surprising, right? All this deep philosophical thinking coming from sermons.
I know, right? You don't always think of sermons as rigorous philosophical treatises.
That's exact.
Butler's work is different. It's full of this analytical precision, careful argumentation. Even philosophers who disagree with his conclusions, they still find his methodology and the sheer intricacy of his arguments really valuable.
Okay.
And his first 3 sermons in particular, those are where he lays out his comprehensive moral philosophy. And it's based on this teleological understanding of human nature.
Okay, wait. Teleological. For anyone listening who isn't a philosopher, break that down for us.
Sure. So teleological basically means understanding things in terms of their purpose, their ultimate goal. Think of a knife. Its purpose is to cut, right? So understanding a knife teleologically means understanding it in relation to that purpose.
Got it. So you're saying Butler believed we need to understand our purpose to understand ourselves and morality.
Exactly. That's where he starts. And from there, he builds this argument about self-love and benevolence.
Okay.
Which back then were often seen as completely opposed to each other. You could be selfish or selfless, but not both. And in the sermons that follow, he digs into all these different facets of moral psychology, self-deception, compassion, forgiveness. He really grounds his philosophy in how we actually operate as human beings.
So instead of just laying down the law,
Yeah.
he's trying to understand the inner workings of our moral lives.
Yeah, exactly.
It's like he's taking this bottom-up approach.
Yeah, a bottom-up approach. And in his preface to the sermons, he actually lays out his vision for, and I quote, morals considered as science. He separates this from practical moralizing and religious revelation.
Okay.
He saw moral philosophy as something that needs to be defended against intellectual objections.
Morals. considered as a science.
Yeah.
So for a philosopher listening, what's the key takeaway about Butler's method here?
Okay, so in the preface, he outlines two main ways to approach this science. One is by looking at the abstract relationships between things.
Okay.
This was a method favored by thinkers like, Samuel Clarke, William Wollaston. They wanted to derive moral obligations from these eternal, immutable truths, almost like mathematical axioms.
Like a top-down theoretical framework.
Exactly. But Butler preferred a different approach. He favored starting with what he called matters of fact.
Matters of fact. So more grounded in, like, observation.
Exactly. Observing human nature, our actual behavior.
Okay.
He believed this had some serious advantages. More applicable to real-world situations, more persuasive to a wider audience. In fact, even in his early letters to Clarke, he hinted that he'd found a new way to establish moral truths.
Oh, so this focus on observation was there from the beginning.
Yeah.
So why did he think this focus on matters of fact was better than relying on these, like, seemingly more certain abstract truths?
You see, someone like Clarke might say vice is contrary to the nature and reason of things.
Right.
But Butler wanted to show that vice is a violation or breaking in upon our own nature.
Okay.
He believed the moral standards we discover within ourselves, those are inherently authoritative for us.
Okay.
Even if we can't, directly grasp these grand metaphysical relations, it's about what's natural and fitting for us as human beings. Something we can access through introspection and by observing our own actions and the actions of others.
Okay, so it's a shift from this purely rationalistic base to one that's grounded in observing human psychology.
Mm-hmm.
But wouldn't arguments based on, like, these probable matters of fact be less certain? Especially for a philosopher who's used to those, like, rigorous deductive proofs.
That's a fair point, and Butler actually addresses this head-on in his analogy. He argues that even deductive arguments, those logically sound ones, they become less certain when you try to apply them to specific actions or individuals.
Okay.
You always need this connecting hypothesis to link those abstract truths to what's actually happening. Like, how do those eternal fitnesses, those abstract truths, how do they actually play out in messy human behavior?
Yeah, good point.
And that hypothesis itself, that link, it's not deductively certain.
Right.
He uses this analogy, something about Cartesian physiology.
Cartesian physiology. Okay, give us that.
So imagine you've got these perfect geometric principles, right?
Okay. But to understand how they apply to a spleen or a liver, you need a hypothesis about how that ideal geometry fits with the messy reality of blood and organs.
Right. You can't just, impose the perfect geometry on the squishy reality of the body.
Exactly. And it's the same with morals. When you apply those abstract moral principles to real-life situations, you need that connecting hypothesis.
Yeah.
And that introduces uncertainty, even if the starting principle is rock solid.
So both approaches, abstract and empirical, they rely on probability when dealing with the real world.
Exactly. And here's Butler's key move. He argues that even probable reasoning can still establish moral obligation.
Okay.
If an action is more likely to be good than not doing anything or doing something else, then unless there's strong evidence to the contrary, that more probably good action, that becomes morally obligatory.
Okay, that's a subtle point, but it makes sense.
And this was also crucial for his arguments in the analogy.
Mm-hmm.
He uses it to argue for the reasonableness of Christian doctrines based on probable evidence, like the existence of an afterlife. Okay, so his methodology, it's all tied up with his view of human nature as something we can observe. So how did he actually see human nature? What are its basic parts, according to Butler?
For Butler, if you want to understand morality, you've got to get a grasp of what motivates human actions.
Right.
He points to several key drivers. Desires for specific pleasures, benevolence, that's our concern for others, self-love, concern for ourselves, and then, most importantly, conscience.
Okay.
So he sees the moral philosopher's job as carefully analyzing these, understanding what each one aims at, and then seeing how they interact, how they might clash.
Yeah, because rarely is it just one motive driving us, right?
Yeah.
It's usually a whole jumble.
Exactly.
Right.
Like, self-love and certain passions can both contribute to the same action.
Right.
So Butler felt he needed to untangle these different principles. Which ones lead to what we see as good or bad behavior?
Yeah.
And this has echoes of Locke,
Locke.
John Locke. Remember his focus on clearing up confusion in knowledge?
Oh, right. Clearing up ambiguities.
Yeah, and Butler's emphasis on nature as a guide that has roots in Stoic philosophy and other ancient ethical traditions.
So he's building on all this history of thought.
Yeah.
Now, he makes some distinctions about the word nature itself. This seems crucial for understanding his viewpoint. Can you unpack that for us?
Okay, so in his second sermon, Butler breaks down the word nature into three different senses. First, it can refer to any inherent principle or element we have, like hunger, our capacity for joy, or our tendency to get angry.
Okay, so that's like nature as anything that's part of us.
Right. Second, it can refer to the strongest among a set of principles. Like if someone criticizes you unfairly, it's more natural to feel defensive or annoyed than to just be indifferent.
Right, so in that case, it's like what we do most forcefully or naturally.
Exactly. But then there's the third sense. This one's the most important for his moral theory.
Okay, what's that?
Here, nature refers to a principle that has this natural supremacy, this authority over other principles and passions. It's like an internal law, a guiding force.
So it's not just about what we do most naturally, but about what should guide us, even if we don't always follow it.
Exactly. And Butler argues that whatever principle has this natural supremacy, it's what gives our various principles a kind of unity. It makes them work together towards specific goals that are inherent to our being.
Okay.
And he says, when we look closely at all the principles within us, we can see that conscience has this natural supremacy.
Okay.
He acknowledges that self-love also has a claim to being supreme, which, as you can imagine, makes things a bit more complicated. We'll get into that. But the key is, this hierarchy isn't determined by how strong these principles are as motivating forces, but by their inherent authority, their role in the overall system of human nature.
So it's like a ranking system, but it's not just about power. It's about rightness or authority.
Yeah, exactly.
Now, he uses analogies to illustrate this hierarchical nature,
Right.
like a watch or a political constitution.
Yeah, those are some of his best-known analogies.
Break those down for us. What was he getting at?
So he compares human nature to a watch. A watch isn't just a bunch of random parts, right? It's about how those parts are designed and work together to keep time.
Okay.
It's the same with us. We're not just a random assortment of desires, but a whole system working towards specific goals.
Got it.
And the fact that we seem to be structured toward these goals, that suggests a hierarchy. Some principles are naturally subordinate to others.
Okay.
He also uses the analogy of a civil constitution,
Hmm?
different branches of government, different authorities, all operating under a bigger framework.
Right.
And when raw power overthrows that order, it violates the nature of the system.
So like a coup, a breakdown of order.
Yeah, and it's similar with us. When our strongest passions override our authoritative principles, it's unnatural in the sense that it disrupts our proper functioning. It goes against our inherent aims.
So if I'm giving in to a fleeting desire, even if it's really powerful at the moment, and ignoring what my conscience is telling me, that's like a breakdown in my own internal order.
Exactly. That natural subordination, that's what keeps us on track, guides us towards those proper ends. And these principles, like conscience, they represent what we ought to act upon, what we ought to live by.
Okay. Now, there's this ongoing debate about Butler, right? Whether we should follow our conscience just because it's in line with our nature or because it's intrinsically good, and that goodness is reflected in our nature.
Yeah, that's a huge question for philosophers. It gets to the heart of some major objections to his whole moral philosophy.
So the ultimate justification for conscience is a bit of a philosophical puzzle.
It is.
All right, let's dig deeper into conscience itself. How does Butler define it, and what gives it this unique authority?
Okay, so Butler, he's building on thinkers like Shaftesbury here. He sees conscience as a reflective principle.
Reflective.
Yeah, it's not just a gut feeling. It's the ability to look inward, to think about our actions before and after we do them, and to evaluate the actions of others. And all this according to some fundamental moral principles. And he said, all of us, every functioning human being, we've got this sense of right and wrong.
Okay.
Even if we use different words for it. Conscience, moral reason, moral sense, divine reason.
Okay.
He sees these as different labels for the same basic capacity. He calls it a sentiment of the understanding or as a perception of the heart.
So it's got this cognitive side, this emotional side?
Yeah, a mix of reason and feeling when we make moral judgments.
Right.
But the authority of conscience, that's paramount. Like in that civil constitution analogy, conscience should be directing our other principles. It's not just one voice in the crowd, not subordinate to those stronger desires.
Okay.
Butler argues that any rational person, when they really think about it, they'll recognize this authority of conscience, and they'll understand that they've got this basic obligation to follow it.
Now, that connects to this idea of autonomy, right? This philosophical concept of being self-governing.
Absolutely. For Butler, Acting according to conscience, that's a core form of self-governance. Yeah. It means being motivated by what we internally understand as right or wrong, not just by external pressures like rewards or punishments.
So, like, I'm not just following the rules out of fear of getting in trouble.
Yeah.
I'm doing it because I see it as the right thing to do.
Exactly. He was critical of people who said that our main motivation for moral behavior was just fear of punishment or desire for reward. He argued that if the reward or punishment is just added on to an action that's already right or wrong in itself, then the connection between the two is arbitrary. It doesn't give you a truly moral motivation.
Right.
When we act solely because of some external thing, we're not really acting from an internal moral law.
So there are definitely echoes of Kant here, right?
Yeah, absolutely. Think about Kant's idea of moral duty.
Right.
That true moral worth comes from acting out of duty, not just because you feel like it or you're afraid of the consequences.
Okay, so there are parallels there. So this law of conscience, as Butler puts it, it's readily accessible to us.
Yeah, he says it's the most near and intimate, the most certain and known. And that contrasts with the often unpredictable consequences of our actions, especially when it comes to self-interest. Whether an action is morally good, that doesn't depend on whether it'll actually lead to the outcome you want in this uncertain world. Outcomes can change, but conscience is fixed, steady, and immovable.
Powerful image.
And he goes on to argue that conscience holds the superior position to our passions, our affections, our instincts. It governs them, sets up a natural hierarchy.
Okay, so it's at the top of the chain of command.
Yeah, exactly.
But as we touched on before, there are some philosophical criticisms, some complexities around this idea of conscience being supreme.
Yeah.
What are some of the main points a philosopher might bring up?
Okay, so there are a few key issues. One is the whole relationship between conscience, self-love, and benevolence.
Okay.
Sometimes Butler seems to say that conscience is above both self-love and benevolence.
Okay.
And that when you understand all three correctly, they'll guide you towards the same actions. But other times, it sounds like he puts self-love on an equal footing with conscience, or even above it.
Okay.
And then there are passages where it seems like benevolence is the whole of virtue, which again implies it's at least as important as conscience.
So the exact order of these principles in his system, it's not always super clear.
Right, and that's led to lots of different interpretations among philosophers, and it raises the question of whether his model really holds together.
Okay, I see. So that's a problem.
Yeah. And then you've got critiques from philosophers like Sidgwick.
Sidgwick, okay.
He challenged the justification for conscience's authority. He asked, are the rules of conscience reasonable in themselves?
Okay.
If they are, then maybe you don't need this separate idea of conscience. It's just reason applied to moral matters. But if they're just arbitrary pronouncements, then why should they have this ultimate authority? He saw potential circularity there.
So it's like, is conscience just saying what's reasonable? Or is it just making stuff up? And if it's just making stuff up, then why should we listen?
Right. And this circularity reminds some people of the Stoic idea of living according to nature, which can be interpreted as living according to reason, and then reason is defined as what's natural.
So it just keeps circling back on itself without a clear foundation.
Exactly. And then there's Sturgeon.
Sturgeon, okay.
He argued that if virtuous actions are those that fit our nature, and vicious actions are those that don't, then this idea of conscience having a special authority becomes redundant.
Okay, I'm following.
If conscience says something is wrong, that wrongness must come from a conflict with some part of our nature, maybe a conflict between different principles within us. Conscience can't be in conflict with itself. That would be circular. So it must be pointing to a conflict with something else, like self-interest.
Right.
But then conscience is just echoing what self-interest already tells us. It's not saying anything new.
So the worry is that Butler's framework collapses into a form of self-interest. Like conscience is just telling us what's good for us anyway.
That's the critique.
Okay.
But defenders of Butler, like Penelum,
Okay.
they say, no, Butler genuinely believed in objective right and wrong, separate from what's natural or unnatural, or what's good for us.
Okay.
So on this view, conscience isn't just reflecting other principles. It has its own ability to grasp those fundamental moral truths.
That's a big difference, right? It's like, is conscience a messenger, or is it the source itself?
Exactly. Now, let's move on to self-love and benevolence. Butler's known for his critique of psychological egoism. What was his argument against it?
Yeah, unpack that for us.
Okay, so his refutation of psychological egoism was pretty influential.
Okay.
There's even this famous quote from the philosopher C.D. Broad. He said Butler killed the theory so thoroughly that he sometimes seems to the modern reader to be flogging dead horses.
Wow. Okay, so he really took it down.
Yeah. So what Butler was arguing against was the selfish theory.
Okay, what's that?
It's the idea that everything we do is ultimately motivated by self-interest or the pursuit of pleasure. And he said this theory misses a crucial distinction: the difference between the principles that make us act and our particular passions or desires.
Okay. Break that down for us. What's the difference there?
He's saying that all our passions, all our desires, they're ours in the sense that we experience them.
Right. I feel my desire for chocolate. It's my desire.
Exactly. But that doesn't mean that their target, what they're aimed at, is always our own self-interest or pleasure.
Okay, so the fact that I feel a desire doesn't automatically make it selfish.
Exactly. Just because I want that chocolate cake doesn't mean my ultimate goal is just to feel the pleasure of eating it.
Okay.
The cake itself, that external object, that's the direct target of my desire. Butler argued that the selfish theorists, they mixed up the fact that we experience the desire with what the desire is actually aimed at.
So just because the desire is mine doesn't mean it's aimed at me.
Right. Sure, we enjoy satisfying our desires, but the desires themselves, they're about those external things, those states of affairs. Ourselves, our own gratification, that's not necessarily the goal of every single impulse we feel.
Okay, so my desire for cake isn't just a roundabout way of wanting pleasure. It's a desire for the cake itself.
Exactly. And he has this great illustration to make this point. It's called the stone argument.
Stone argument.
Yeah. He says, all particular appetites and passions are towards external things themselves, distinct from the pleasure arising from them.
Okay.
He argues that the pleasure we get from something, that depends on there being a prior suitableness between the object and the passion. Like, we enjoy eating food because we have an appetite for it, a natural desire to eat.
Right.
But if our only motivation was pleasure, then we wouldn't have any reason to enjoy eating food more than, say, swallowing a stone.
Swallowing a stone.
Yeah, because the pleasure would be the same, right, if it was just about the feeling.
Right.
The fact that we do have specific desires for specific things, that shows that our passions are about those things, not just the pleasure we get from them.
Okay, so the desire comes first, it's aimed outward, and the pleasure is a result of fulfilling that desire.
Exactly.
This is really interesting because it changes how we think about motivation. Right. It's not all just about me, me, me.
Right. And this leads him to another crucial point: the difference between these particular passions and the principle of self-love.
Okay, so what's the difference?
Self-love, for Butler, is this broader concern for our happiness, well-being, long-term flourishing.
Okay.
It's a higher level thing that guides us towards our overall self-interest. But it's different from our individual immediate desires, like hunger, thirst, wanting to be respected.
Okay, I see.
Sure, we get pleasure from fulfilling those desires, and that contributes to our overall happiness, which is what self-love is aiming at.
Right.
But the specific feeling of hunger or the feeling of being respected, those aren't self-love. They're particular experiences with their own targets. Just because we experience those things doesn't mean we're fundamentally driven by selfishness.
Okay, so self-love is about the big picture, those long-term goals. And passions are about specific, immediate things.
Yeah, that's a good way to put it.
Now, where does benevolence fit into all this? Our concern for others.
All right, so here, Butler draws on people like Shaftesbury, Hutcheson.
Okay.
He believed it was just a plain fact that humans have genuine benevolent motivations.
So we actually care about other people, not just ourselves.
Exactly. And he saw it as obvious that acting benevolently could make us happy, that it could be consistent with our own self-interest.
Okay.
He flipped the burden of proof, basically. It was up to those who said we're all ultimately selfish to prove it.
Interesting.
He specifically critiques Hobbes, for example. Hobbes tried to say that compassion was just a disguised form of self-interest, like fear of experiencing that suffering ourselves.
Okay, so like, I'm only compassionate because I'm afraid of ending up in the same boat.
Yeah, but Butler says that doesn't make sense. If my compassion for a friend in distress was just fear, then I'd be afraid of my friends, and that contradicts our whole understanding of friendship.
Right. It just doesn't match our experience.
Exactly. So he's saying genuine care for others, that's a fundamental part of being human, not just a mask for selfishness.
Okay, so he's pushing back against this purely egoistic view of human nature.
Absolutely. And he admits that our motives are often mixed, right?
Yeah, we're not always pure in our intentions.
Right. But he says the very fact that we have mixed motives means there must be genuinely unselfish motives to begin with. Otherwise, what would selfishness be mixed with?
It makes sense. You can't mix something with nothing.
Exactly. And he says his view, which recognizes both self-regarding and other regarding motivations, it's simpler, more coherent, and more in line with how we actually live.
Okay, now Butler gives a specific definition of self-love. He called it regard to our own interest, happiness, and private good. But he adds a crucial detail about how it's pursued. What's that detail, and why is it important?
Right, so he says that self-love is best pursued through cool reason.
Cool reason. What does he mean by that?
He means impartial, calm, dispassionate reasoning, not swayed by those immediate, strong passions or by our natural bias toward ourselves.
Okay, so it's like taking a step back, looking at the big picture.
Exactly. It's figuring out what really aligns with our long-term interests and well-being, and that often means overriding those short-term urges.
Right.
And when you understand and practice self-love in this way, it can lead to actions that might seem to go against your immediate selfish interests.
Okay.
Butler argues that constantly chasing instant gratification, always putting yourself first, that's not actually the best way to be happy.
Interesting.
He says happiness consists in the gratification of certain affections, appetites, passions with objects which are by nature adapted to them.
Okay.
And self-love, guided by reason, that's what points us towards the right kinds of gratification and helps us avoid things that would ultimately make us unhappy.
So it's not just about getting what you want when you want it. It's about making choices that lead to genuine, lasting happiness.
Exactly.
And that's where he sees self-love and virtuous behavior aligning.
Yeah.
Right. It's a key part of his argument against this inherent conflict between self-interest and morality.
Yeah, that's a core part of his thinking. He believed the conflict between self-love and benevolence, it's mostly an illusion.
Yeah.
It comes from misunderstanding both of them. Those specific benevolent passions, like compassion and generosity, they fit perfectly well with a rationally guided self-love.
Okay.
In fact, Butler said that enjoying virtuous acts, seeing them as part of your own happiness, that's a sign of a well-ordered, happy person.
So doing good actually makes you feel good.
Right. And in his analogy, he takes it further. He says that virtue naturally tends towards happiness and vice towards misery.
Okay.
Though those long-term consequences might not always be obvious right away. The world's a complicated place.
Right.
He even uses the example of a virtuous monarchy. He imagines a monarchy where everyone's acting virtuously, and he argues that this would lead to more happiness for society, more stability, even more political power in the long run.
So it's like this vision of moral harmony.
Yeah.
You're acting for the good of others, and that ultimately benefits you too.
Yeah, that's the idea. But he's careful to say that conscience, virtue, and self-love aren't exactly the same thing.
Okay.
They're connected, they reinforce each other, and when you get them right, they point you in the same direction, but they're distinct.
Okay, that's helpful.
For Butler, a virtuous life, it tends to go hand in hand with our true long-term self-interest.
Okay.
Because it involves this balance of good feelings toward others, listening to our conscience, and pursuing our own well-being in a rational way.
Got it. So what about benevolence itself? Is it just one passion among many, or does it have a bigger role in his ethics?
So, most of the time when he talks about benevolence, he's referring to a specific passion, or maybe a group of related passions that are other-directed. But sometimes he uses it more broadly,
Okay.
along with terms like love of thy neighbor, and then it's more like a general principle that should guide us towards promoting the well-being of others. Philosophers are still debating which sense is more central to his overall thought. As a particular passion, benevolence is like any other passion. It's not inherently selfish or unselfish.
Okay.
Whether it aligns with our self-love depends on whether acting benevolently makes us happy or fits with our broader self-interest.